Right, so hello, I've started the recording. We have to talk about a couple of things about events which we didn't get to last time, and then we're going to mainly talk about CSS, and we're going to go through CSS selectors, which are a way of searching for nodes in a tree, actually, and about the rendering logic, the traditional rendering logic, because CSS also has evolved in time, and lately it's gotten more and more modern. So first things first, like I said, we're going to want to look over some examples relating to events, and I'm just going to paste them here, and we're going to talk about them. So let's first look at this example. So what we have here is a bunch of divs which are defined one inside the other one, right? So it's so the innermost is D3, it's contained by D2, and then it's contained by D1. So the question becomes, what happens when I click the text, right? So when I click the text, which of these handlers is going to be called? Well, as an aside, because I don't think we went over this query selector method on document actually selects the first element which matches some CSS selector of some sort. And this particular CSS selector is the ID selector. We're going to come back to this later on, but sharp sign and some string is going to select something with the ID some string, which matches these things. Now, what happens when I click some text is that each of these handlers is going to be called in a particular order. And let's see this, because it's going to be clearer. Right, so D3 was called first, then D2, and then D1. That's because, by default, events in JavaScript bubble. And to think of this metaphor, it's like little air bubbles in water. They rise to the surface. Right, and this is what's happening here. So first of all, the innermost element had the chance to run its handler. Then the next, its parent, and then the parent of the parent, and so forth, until it gets to window. Now this is called event propagation. It can be changed. So whenever I define an event listener with add event listener, I have an additional parameter, which is a configuration object, in which I can switch from event bubbling, what I've just described, to event capturing. Now, event capturing is actually going to mean that the direction is going to be the reverse. This is less useful than event bubbling, which is the more intuitive fashion, the more intuitive way of doing things. Now, event propagation can be stopped, and for example, if we uncomment this line, which is event stop propagation, I'm never going to get to the handler for D1. Let's just see this in action. Right, so it's just D3 and D2 because propagation was stopped. Now, the second thing we want to see about the events is that some components have some default behavior, such as when I click a link, it typically navigates from that based on the href of that link, it navigates to that page. Now, again, this is also something which happens for any event. And let me just find an example. I don't think I have one, so let's just write it. So considering we have a link, it's going to be ahref. So let's say it goes to Google. Now obviously this is going to behave just like we'd expect, which is we click the link and it takes us to Google. However, let's assume we give our link an ID and then we associate a handler on the click. So we're gonna do window.onLoad, so it's loaded, and inside we're gonna say document get element by ID A1 dot add event listener. I'm gonna say it's a click listener, and this does something of some event. Right, so what we can do is say event dot stop propagation. This is going to no, sorry, event.prevent default. And this is going to prevent the default behavior of the link, so it's no longer going to navigate to Google, and we can add our own behavior. Nope. Right, so it's not going to navigate in this case. Right, so it no longer navigates. Right, so this is also something which exists on all events. Now the third thing we want to see is that although we have this behavior on all events, there are some events which contain additional information. Now we're going to do something trivial, such as we're going to look at the mouse event. I don't care about this. So what's going to happen here is whenever I click either this button or I click the document, this which function will be run, which is going to tell me which button I've clicked. Right, so it's this information exists in the mouse event itself. Mouse event is going to be a type which inherits event. Obviously, I'm not going to have a button for an onload event, right? But I am going to have a button for a mouse event. Now, this whole button thing is relatively useful. What's more useful is the fact that I can read the position of the mouse. But we're not going to deal with this right now. Now, what happens when I right-click something in the document? Let's just comment this for a bit. Is this thing is going to open, right? The contextual menu. And the opening of the contextual menu is an event on document which is called context menu. But we can prevent this and just write what button was clicked. It's the right mouse button. And if I click the button, it's the left mouse button. Right, so there's a bunch of information I can get from a particular event. Now the fourth thing we want to look at, and you had an example at your tutorials, but we want to look over this, is that I can create a custom event. Right, and a custom event is just going to be me instantiating an event or something which inherits event. I can also inherit event and make my own type. I have little motivation to do this unless I want some complex behavior, because I can actually decorate the event object, so I can put some additional information in it so that it's visible. It's visible in whatever the event is handled. So again, let's look at an example. Right. So let's consider this particular structure. We're going to write it somewhat, and we have a couple of divs. Now D1 is not going to have a click handler, but D2 is going to have a click handler. So let's just define these. So we're going to say window.onload is some function. Sorry, I forgot my script. And here we're going to need our div. So we're going to say const D1 is document get element by ID D1. And let's get the other one with query selector. Now, query selector, which we're going to see how the selectors work shortly. Query selector is going to, like I said, give me the first element that matches something. Now, since we're selecting based on an ID, there should be only one of them either way, because the ID is there to give a unique identifier to something in the document. Now there's another method which is called query selector all, which is going to return all elements that match something, match a particular selector. Like I said, D1 isn't going to have a click handler. It's going to have a handler based on some event which we don't have yet. We're going to call it alarm, and we're just going to say console log I have been alarmed. Now as it stands, this handler is useless because there's nothing in the browser by default which emits alarm. Now what we're going to do is on the click on D2, we're going to want to manually create and dispatch this event. So we're going to just const event as new event of event type, and obviously it's alarm in this case. Now we can also populate some other things on it, right? Some prop, and they're going to be sent to the handler. going to be visible in the handler. Let's not overcomplicate this though. So we're gonna say d1.dispatch event, and this is a method which is going to work on d1 because it's going to work on any event target. Now all HTML elements are event targets, so they inherit event target. So we're just going to dispatch alarm. And if we look at our example, which is 4, what's going to happen is we're going to click D2. This is going to create and dispatch an alarm event, which is going to be handled by the handler on D1. Right, a dispatch event of event. Right, so now it's going to write I have been alarmed. Okay, so this handles what we had left from our little event for a last time. We're going to go through to the CSS part, but first I'm going to pause the recording if you have any. Okay, so now let's continue with the main part of our discussion, which is CSS, and we're going to look over CSS selectors and over the, let's call it, traditional ways of rendering in CSS. So there's two distinct topics here because CSS selectors are useful for CSS, but don't really concern only CSS. Because if I think about the process through which the browser is going to actually draw something in my window, the first thing so the browser in terms of stages, the browser has already constructed the DOM. So it has the structure of the page, which is based on what I've written in my HTML the HTML code. Now I need to do a couple of things. So first of all, before drawing all the nodes in this tree, I need to know what characteristics they have, right? So how are they supposed to be drawn, right? What's their color, what's their font, etc. So what I need to do is go through this DOM and have a way of associating a bunch of properties to each node. Now these properties are from a relatively large list. Like I said, they include color, font size, and stuff which is more difficult to understand. Um, but in order to associate these properties to the nodes, as a prerequisite, I need a way to select a subset of the nodes. Right? I need to have a subset of the nodes which are green or something, which have the color green. And this is where CSS selectors come in, because to select a subset of the nodes, I need a way of a language which selects a subset of the nodes of a tree. This is what CSS selectors do. Uh, After I've associated all these properties and I know what I'm supposed to draw, I'm going to get to the drawing part, which is going to consist in building something which is a rendering tree. So it's a tree in which each node is a drawable little rectangle. But we're going to see there's some distinction here. It's a bit more complicated than that. But first, let's talk about our selectors and how selectors relate to each other. So first things first, we're just going to want to see how to include CSS in a file, uh, and how this all works out. So there's three ways of using CSS in a file, and let's assume we have three divs. So the first div is going to be ID d1. The second div is going to be ID d2, and the third div is going to be ID d3. And let's just write something in them. It doesn't really matter what. So the first way is to use the style block. Right, so for a style block, let's say we're going to use the same thing we've already seen, which is we're going to select the div with ID d1, and this is going to allow me to say color. So color is going to be the foreground color, or the color of the text, or we could use background color, which is the color of the background. So let's just use background color. It's going to be more visible. Now a couple of things to note. Now this is a CSS rule, so it has a selector, what it applies to, and then it has a block of rules which are going to be key value pairs. Now the second thing to notice, as I'd expect background color to be a color, and I've written a sort of string here. I've written aqua. Now this is something which is called the named color, which is just an easier way of referring to and using colors. But colors in JavaScript are going to be these numbers, which are going to be the values for RGB, so red, green, blue, or the values for RGBA, which is red, green, blue, and transparency, or alpha. So if I wanted something to be red, for example, obviously if I write red, I'm going to know how it looks. But if I write something like this without a renderer, I don't really know how it looks, right? But let's say it's red, and let's progressively test this stuff. So this one is red. Now the second way of including CSS, right, of using CSS, is to use a tag called length, which is going to include CSS from a external file. So let's say css 5.css. Now this assumes we have a folder here called css, and there's a 5.css there. And here, what we're going to do is we're going to say the same thing. We're going to say d2 background color, some color. Right. Now the third way of including CSS is to use one of the global attributes we've talked about last time, and it's an attribute called style. So I can just write here color blue, background color blue, so it's more visible. Right. Now, there's a question which comes here, which is these rules work in parallel, right? So it's D1, D2, D3. But what happens if they overlap each other, right? What if I have two rules for something with the ID D1? Well, in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to wonder which rule has precedence, or in CSS terms, which rule is more specific, which rule has the greater specificity. Now, the general principle of this is something as old as civilization, more or less, which is the idea that something, if you write a bunch of rules, a more specific rule, defines an exception from a more generic rule. And this also applies in CSS. Unfortunately, the way that CSS defines specificity is not the generally intuitive way we use in real life. Now, if I have two rules which have the same specificity, whatever that means, the latter one is going to be the one that applies. Now, in our case, style and length, these two, the rules which come from style or from length, have the same specificity. There's nothing different between them, so what's going to matter is which comes later. As for what happens to D3, the style attribute is actually going to have much higher specificity. So let's investigate the specificity business by exploring what CSS selectors we have at our disposal. So we're going to see them and see how this all works. So for this, let's have a new file, and this a new file 6.html, and this we're going to, I think I have it here, right? So it's this. It just contains three divs. One which is just a div, one which is a div with the class alpha, and one which is a div with the class alpha and d1 and ID d1. So let's create 6.css and look over this. Right. So if I want to write a rule which says all divs have an orange background, I can write it like this. And I'm going to notice if I test it out that indeed all divs are going to have the background or the orange background. Now, the way to compare two rules to see which one is the more specific is to calculate something which is called specificity. Now, specificity is going to be a set of numbers, or alternatively, I could think of it as one number in a really high base. Now, the way this works is I'm going to write it as a comment is that the specificity of this one is this. So it's 0001. In Visual Studio Code, I can actually see a way of representing this. It just says 001, and we're going to see shortly why. Now, there's a general rule, which is just a star, which means it applies to all HTML elements, and that has specificity of 0. This one is what is called an element rule, right? So it says all divs, so all elements of type div are going to have the background color orange. And the element rule actually refers to the first position from the right to the left, so the least relevant position in specificity. So it's 0001 because I've counted all the element selectors. Because I've counted all the element selectors, but there's just one, this is a unit. This is a unit selector. It's the unit of the elements. Now, if I want all things, all elements with class alpha to have background color something, green. Now, this has a specificity which is 0010. That's because that position in the specificity corresponds to class selectors. Now, the next position, we could select something which has the ID D1. And this also has some background color. And this has the specificity 0100. So this again is a unit selector. These are my unit selectors. So if I look at my specificity, the first position is going to typically be 0. And internally, it is only 1 if that rule was defined in the style attribute, which is why I said that the style attribute has really high specificity. Now, the second position, from left to right, is going to be reserved for the number of ID selectors. The third position for the number of class selectors, and the fourth one for the number of element selectors. We're going to see that this is a bit more complicated, but this is the general thing. So let's see what happened. So each one is differently colored, and if I inspect the ID selector, I can see how the styles were applied. Now, CSS is called cascading style sheets because styles are applied in a cascade. And this is my cascade, only it's from bottom to top. Right? So I've had this div display block, which comes from the browser itself. Then I've overwritten it with this one, which is just the divs. I've added this one, which is just the divs. Then I've overwritten this with a more specific selector, which is alpha, and then an even more specific one, which is D1. And if I put something on element style, right, in the style property, it's going to be even more specific and it's going to overwrite everything. Now, to check that this is the case and the order doesn't matter, let's just change the order. And of course, nothing's going to matter, nothing's going to change because what applies is is given by the specificity, not by the order. The order only matters if I have two things with identical specificity, but if something is more specific, it's going to override something more generic. Okay, so this is the unit selectors. However, if I think about using selectors for each of these, I actually have a JavaScript function. So it's get element by ID, get elements by class name, get elements by tag name. So they're not really all that useful. And if CSS selectors would only be able to do what I've just done, there wouldn't be much point to them, right? They would be somewhat redundant. So let's look at some other types of selectors and how they relate to this. So the first thing we want to see is we have selectors which express things in terms of the relationship between elements, right? So parent-child or siblings and so forth. Because, like I said, we're actually searching in a tree. It's not a linear structure. So let's first create some sort of HTML file, and which fits our purposes. So let's say we have a div which contains a p, which contains a span, and we have a div which just contains a span. And I'm just going to write the styles here when they're simple, so as we would make better use of time. Right, so what I might want to say is all the divs and all the spans which are descendants of no matter what degree of some div, right? So if I consider a div, it has a little subtree under it. And if a span is in that subtree, it fits the rule. So I'm going to say div span, background color, something. Now, please observe that both of these fit, right? So if we look at 7. If we look at 7, right, they're both violet, or whatever color this is, blue-violet. Now, what if I want to say all the spans which are children of divs, so they're just descendants of the first degree? Well, I could write this like div span. And I see this happens. Right. So, first thing to note is this span is direct descendant of this div. This span is not direct descendant of this div. Second thing to note, well, space I can't use in CSS. I can't use, let's say, static spaces, right? Because space is an operator, and it's the operator which signals tree descent, right? So whenever I run into a space, I have to descend at least one level within the tree of elements. Now, if I read the first one from left to right, I'm going to say select all divs, and then from their subtrees select spans. If I read it from right to left, it's going to be all spans which are descendants of any degree of all divs. And for specificity, I can see that I have two element selectors, so it's 0, 0, 0, 2. Right, now, talking about specificity though, if we talk about the situation in real life, we'd say, well, this particular set of things is a subset of this particular set of things, which means, intuitively, this one should be more specific. Now, this is not true in CSS, because if you look at it, both of them have the same specificity, because specificity is just calculated based on a bunch of simple rules. Now, because both of them have the same specificity, this means that the second rule applies only for the reason that it comes later. So if we change their position, we're going to see both elements are going to be blue-violet. Right, which may or may not be what we expected, depending on the case. Right, the next thing we want to talk about is, I said we have some selectors we talked in terms of siblings. We can also add them here. So let's just have an image just so we can refer to it. We're not going to use an actual image. And we have a span. Then we have, say, a div, and then another span. Right, so this span comes immediately after this image, while this one doesn't. And we can write a couple of rules, and we're going to say image tilde span, background color, let's say this one. And if we look here, we're going to see both of them have been colored. That's because that tilde operator tells me it's any element which fits the, so any, in this case, any span, which comes after an image in the child collection, right? It's something which comes after our image. However, if we want, just like we had further up, if we want something which comes immediately after, we can say image plus span, and this is going to be something else. Right, so only that one comes immediately after. And again, I can check this stuff out by looking over what applied. Right, so here we have image tilde span and then image plus span because it comes later. They have the same specificity. Whilst here, this didn't actually match image plus span, just image tilde span. Right, so let's continue. I said that when talking about specificity, what I'm doing is actually I'm looking at the selector and I'm counting what each of the things is. And I said that so we have the style attribute, then we have the IDs, then the classes, and then the elements. But it's just a bit more complicated than that because we have some other things, such as let's try to understand the problem so that we see why this is the solution. So let's consider we have a list. 1 second. Yeah, so let's consider we have a list. So we have some sort of HTML file which contains a list. It's going to be an ordered list just so we can refer to it easier. And it has a bunch of these little list items. I think this is 8, so we just don't skip one. Right. So let's imagine we want to style the elements of this list. How would we go about it? Well, we might do it like this. Let's say this is first, and we're gonna give it a class, and we're gonna say first. Well, but if we want this for each of them, we're gonna say second for this and so forth. And we're going to go through the whole list. Now, what if we wanted to take into account if they're on an odd or even position? Now, let's say we rely on how people understand things which are visible, so we start from 1. So we're going to say this one is also odd and this one is even. And we're going to add a bunch of classes. Now, because what we're doing here would lead to really unreadable code, and we'll write a lot of stuff without any, would write a lot of this boilerplate stuff. The browser actually has something which is called the pseudo class. Has pseudo classes. So pseudo classes are classes which I have not defined, but the browser behaves as if I've defined them. Right. So let's just go to a let's have some CSS. I think we can write it in a style block here. So what we might write is li colon first child. This means list items which are the first child of their parent. And I'm gonna say background color something. Okay, and it's now green yellow, or what was that? Now again we can do li last child, and this is going to give us, I'm gonna say background color gray. Well, that works. Now we might think about generalizing this, and we're gonna have nth child, so the nth child of some child, I don't know, 3. Please observe that this happens starting from 1, not from 0. Right. So this starts from one sec. Sorry. Okay. So I was saying I can do ant child. Now the next thing I can do is to refer to my elements, like I said, as being odd children or even children. Now this is actually a more flexible mechanism than this. It's just not really frequently used. Because if I write something like odd, that's fine. I can give it a color. Right, so every odd row is colored. Now this is really useful. Now the reason it's really useful is if I have limited space and I want to define the elements of a list or the rows of a table or something similar, I'm going to have to either use borders, right, to just put the frame around them and have them bordered, or do this thing. And if I use borders and I have limited space, what I'm doing is I'm actually losing some pixels. So it's really useful to do this because they're visually distinct, right, without wasting any space. Now, I was saying that this mechanism is more complex because I can actually write something like this. I can write some expression in the parentheses. I can write odd and even. I can also write something like this, 2n plus 13. But this is not really useful, in real life. So what I'd probably write is 2n plus 1, 2n, sorry, which is even. So it's the same thing as odd and even. I might imagine some structures which have cycles of 3 elements. It's not that frequent. Orange. Right. Now, apart from this, I have a couple of other pseudo classes which are nth of type. Right. So I'm not looking for the nth child, but rather the nth div. Right. So pseudo classes, because they're pseudo classes, are actually counted in specificity on the class position. Right. So now we have count IDs, then count pseudo classes and pseudo classes, and then count elements. But there's something else on the class position, and to understand this, let's look at the situation. So let's have 9.html, and let's say we have a doc, and here we have a form, and we have some style, and in the form we have a couple of inputs. We don't really care, it's a form. So you're gonna have input text and input password. Now, how would I differentiate between these two? Now, what I might do is to each of them add a class which basically doubles the value of the attribute. So I'm going to say input type text, class text, input type password, class password. But that again doesn't seem like an ideal solution, does it? So what I actually need is some sort of selector which is going to match the existence or some condition over an attribute. So if I want to select everything which has the attribute type, so it just exists, I can write something like this. So something which has the attribute type has background color, something. Now, if we look at this, we can see how it looks. It looks like this. However, I might want to say, okay, so everything has the background color orchid, apart from the things which have type equals password, which have the background color tomato. Right. Now again, something to notice is that these two actually work like they do because this one comes later, because they're equally specific. And like I said, they're counted on the class position, so it's 0, 0, 1, 0. Now, to further explore the idea of attribute selectors, let's do another example and see that we can actually use a bunch of operators which are, let's say, regex inspired. So first we're going to need some sort of HTML, and we're going to have this one. And second, so style, we're going to want to select a bunch of stuff. So let's say we want to do, so we've seen, if we look at this example, we've seen equality, right? So type equals password. But let's say here we want to do something else. So we want to say all elements for which the class attribute starts with ABC. It's going to be class starts with ABC. Okay, so this matches both of them. Now we might want to do something else, which is class contains ABC, which is star equal. Now everything that starts with also contains. So this is actually going to overwrite all the instances of the previous rule. Now we might also want to do class ends with x, y, z. Right, which is going to match second. And there's a fifth operator, if it's, or a fourth operator, depends on how you look at it, which is called word contains, which is contains something but as a separate word. Now to give you an example, ABCDEF contains ABC but doesn't word contain ABC. Now, while this one, third, ABC space DEF, word contains ABC. So it contains it as a separate word, where a separate word is either the whole value, or it's at the start followed by a space, it's at the end preceded by a space, or it's in the middle, both preceded and succeeded by a space. Right, so word contains is going to be tilde equal, and it's actually going to match the div which contains third. Right, so that one's going to become cyan, while the other one is going to stay just like it was before. Right, so these are attribute selectors. um, Now this sort of completes what can happen on the second position, so the class position. Now what about elements? Is there something similar for elements? Well, there is. So let's look at another situation and see why and how that works. So let's say we have a nope. We have a text. It can a HTML. It contains a div which contains a bunch of text. Let me just find the bunch of text. Right. It contains a bunch of text. It doesn't matter what the text is. It's just a bunch of it. Now, what we might want to do, if you remember seeing in books, you have that style in which the first letter of each chapter is larger than the other letters. Right, so we might want to do that. So now this also brings us to measurements in CSS. We're not going to discuss them in detail today. Um, but so typically we're going to talk in pixels, but in this situation we're not. So there's a unit of measurement called an EM, which represents the standard standard size of text. So the standard font size. And we can refer to it to make things which are relatively larger than text. So in this case, what we want to do, we're going to say that the first letter is larger than the rest of the text. Now, we might do this, and we could do this. We could do this for each first letter, and this would actually work out all right, right? But it would be harder to read and so forth. So just like for pseudo classes, I have access to some classes I've not defined. In this case, I'm going to have access to some elements I've not defined. And in this case, it's the span I've just written here. So I can write something like div first letter. Font size, this is going to be the size, and it's going to be 4em. So now let's first see how this looks. See, this letter is larger. Now, a couple of things. Depending on how much the browser you're using conforms to the standard, you can select this or not. This is a pseudo element because it's an element we've not defined. Um, the second thing, typically pseudo elements are written with two of these in front, right? Two columns. But depending on how conformant your browser is, it might accept it with just one column. Now, in this case, what we've had is an element which we could actually define. But what about the first row of letters or of words, right? I can see that depending on how much I zoom, there are more or less words on it. So I couldn't define it through HTML. I could define it through JavaScript, but it would be a bit more complicated. So instead of doing that, I can refer to it with div first line. Right, and it still works. Right, so I could define this, but not through simple HTML. What about this? With the text I'm selecting? Could I define this one? Well, there's no way of doing this. So it's really useful that I do have a pseudo element which refers to selected text. Notice that selected text on my virtual machine, which is a Linux machine, is something orangey. It's something with orange. If you select text on your machines, if you have Windows, it's going to be something with blue. So I might want my web page to have a consistent style independent of device. Right? So for example, what I might want to do is to say div selection, and let's say we have a stylish little site which is black and white. Right? So we're gonna say background color black and color white. Right? So we've changed this. Additionally, this sort of pseudo element selector can refer to non-existent events, not non-existent elements. For example, let's consider another thing, which is we have a span here. And I am a span. We can do something like this. We can say span pseudo element before content I am dynamically added. Right, and I can see here that it's been dynamically added. Now, the way this is useful is, let's consider something else. Let's say we have a list and we want to have a list of things, but so we want an unordered list. Instead of bullets, we want little hearts. Now, the way we do this, so for now it's just bullets. So the way we do this, we're gonna say ul list style none. This is going to give us the list without the bullets. And then we will want to do ul li before and write something. Let's say Unicode heart. Right, and we might want to do this. How do I copy this? That you want to be copied? Copy. Okay, so we might do this. And we have our little heart list. Right, so getting back to our discussion, whenever we're talking about specificity, I'm going to count each pseudo element as an element. So now I have all my position filled. Right? Now we need to see a couple more things. One of them is what's going to happen with something which is called important. Now I shouldn't use important to cover my own failings. I should avoid using it, but there are situations where I need it, such as for example, I use the code written by somebody else, and that conflicts with the styles of my application. And I don't actually have access to the source, although since the web is transparent, I can see what applies. Now, what I might do is use something which is called important. Let's just go to yeah, let's just go to this one. It's 6. I'm gonna make a copy of 6, and let's have a 13 CSS, which is also going to be a copy of 6. Right, so we saw that the selector with the class was more specific than the one with the element, and the one with the ID was more specific than the one with the class. But I can change this, right? So I can just put here important. Let's just see how it looks before we do this. Right, so it looks like this. But if we put important here, now this one is going to make everything orange. Interestingly enough, important is going to be more powerful than even what I've written on the style element. Let's just do that. Style, background color, something. Right? And nothing's going to be blue. So important overwrites everything. Now the question becomes, what if I have two things in conflict with important? Well, the answer is that between important things, specificity is going to be considered. Right? So if I go here, this is also going to become green yellow because it's more specific. They're just going to ignore whatever is not important. Now the last thing we want to see about CSS selectors is something else, which is something which is an operator but relates to specificity. It's something which is called the not operator. So let's consider this. So I have two divs. One of them has class alpha and the other one has alpha beta. So what if I want to select everything that has class alpha but not class beta? Well, I can write it like this. I can write it class alpha, not beta. Let's just put it in a style block. Alpha, not beta. And we're going to say, I don't know, background color, blue violet. Now, this looks strange, right? So this looks like a pseudo class, but actually it isn't. When calculating the specificity of such a selector, I'm going to ignore the not and just calculate specificity for the rest. So in this case, it's going to be 0, 0, 2, 0. Right? So I'm just going to calculate the specificity of its complement, so to speak. Right? So I'm just going to ignore the not. So that would be the discussion about specificity. I'm going to pause the recording so you can ask me any questions before we go on to layout. Right, so continuing, our next subject of topic of discussion is going to be, let's call it traditional CSS, traditional rendering, right? So how do I specify how something is actually drawn in CSS, right? And for this, we're going to, I think, go to a little presentation. We're not going to follow it step by step, just want it as a guide. So the first thing we want to take into account is something which is called the box model, which relates to dimensions. Now this is not really all that explicit, but if we look at this, we see that for anything we select, I have this little drawing here, right? And this is the box model. Now the box model refers to how I specify the size of a particular component. Now the sizes here are in pixels, and we're going to use them in pixels ourselves. Like I said, we're going to discuss next time what kind of measurements I have at my disposal. But I notice that using the metaphor of a painting, this part in the middle is the content, which is the painted part. Then I might have padding, which is a space which exists between the painted part and the frame of the painting. Then I have a border, which is the actual frame of the painting. And then I have the margin, which is actually the distance I have between my painting and the neighboring one, right? If I put them on a wall. Now, all of these have properties for them. So we have border, padding, border, margin. All of these properties are directional. So I have padding top, padding bottom, left and right, and the same for each of them. And all of these can be manipulated through some composite properties. So if I don't have to write padding left, padding right, padding top, padding bottom, I can just write padding, and then it's going to populate all those properties. And the same for all of them. Some of them are even more complex than that. Now, conversely, let's just see first. Let's just see how that works, and then we'll continue with our discussion. So, this is the way to specify dimensions, something relating to the box model. Now, something to note is that not all things are dimensionable, right? I can't actually resize everything. They have to have certain characteristics, which we're going to see a bit later. So first off, let's have a simple example. So we have doc, and they have a div, and the div actually has two children and part two. And we're just going to make a style block here, and here we're gonna just call this container just so it's easier. So we're gonna say container. So first things first. By default, it's not this one. What number? It's 15. So by default, they just look like this. So something to note about divs is that they come with something which is display block. Now what display block means is displayed sort of like a paragraph, which in turn means that they're going to take as much space as they have available horizontally, and vertically they're going to take as much space as they need, right? So as much space as they need to display their content. Now we're going to do something else, which is we're going to say that container is actually has a height of 400 pixels and a width of 400 pixels. Right, nothing to see. Let's just actually put a color for it. So color cyan. Nope. Oh, background color. And to have a distinct image, let's have the other two be some other colors. Now let's style them together. So we're gonna say part one, and if I want to have multiple selectors which have the same rules, I can write something like this. Now, something to note is that these are actually separate selectors. So the specificity of this is not 0, 2, 0, 0. It's two selectors with 0, 1, 0, 0. It's just they have the same rules for them. Right? And let's just leave it like this for now. Right, it looks horrible, but I can see that what happened is that the children had as much size as the parent could provide for them. Right, so they have a size relative to their parent. Let's just resize them as well. And let's use a better color. Right. So the parent is a bit wider and they fit vertically. Where they're vertical, well, something which is display block is going to actually it's going to something which is display block is actually not going to allow anything else on the same line with them, right? So the only option they have is to be one under the other, even if they don't have enough width to occupy the whole line. But let's see something strange, because this has a connection to what we've discussed about the box model. What happens if we use some padding? Now padding is going to be the space between the border and the content of the component. So let's say you have 2 pixels of padding. Well, it doesn't seem to fit anymore, right? Now this seems to indicate that the height of my component doesn't actually refer, it refers just to the content, not to the content and the padding. Now let's see what border does. Now border is another composite property which I can use. So let's say we have 3 pixel solid black. Now this is actually 12 properties because it's directional, so it's top, left, right, bottom, and then it's border style, it's border width, border style, border color in 4 directions. And I can see definitely that it doesn't fit now. Now what I can do though is to use a property called box sizing, which I can say is border box. Okay, so this is going to calculate whenever I specify a width, this is actually going to calculate it in relation to the content, the padding, and the border. Now this brings us to an interesting point, which is CSS is a rolling standard itself, which means there's a value called padding box, for example. So if we look at border box on can I use, if we look at this, we can see what browsers support border box, and it's most of them. We don't really care about Internet Explorer 6 or 7, right? So that's if we use this and it doesn't work there, it's not a tragedy. How about padding box? Well, if we look at padding box, it's actually mostly unsupported. It's theoretically part of the standard, but since it's unsupported, it's somewhat of a bad idea to use it if I want to have a consistent experience for users on multiple devices. Right, so we can consider that box sizing can be content box or border box, and that's it. Okay, so this is the sizing part. Now, let's see what else is relevant. Let's look at the presentation for a bit, because we have a nice list here. Oh yeah, so I also have min height, min width, min max height, max width. So that's if I want to set some limits, not a precise size. But we're not really interested in that. We're interested in, okay, so how components are drawn. Now typically the browser has a plan, so to speak. So if I don't intervene in any way, the browser draws the components, right? That's all fine. So what I'm doing is actually telling the browser to do something else other than the default. Now some of my components have default styles, and we saw last time, for example, headings. I can override those default styles and make them look however I want them to look. Now whenever drawing something, the browser is going to take into account a bunch of things. So its dimensions, and we've just seen this, except for margin, but we'll get back to margin shortish. Um, its display type, and we saw that divs are display block, and we have to investigate what that means. Its positioning, and this covers 2 things. One of them, which is clearly about positioning, which is a property which is called position, and one of them is a property which is called float. Then its relation to other components, right? So margins, for example, will compose in some way, so they're going to be affected by their neighbors, and other external information. Now, this other external information, we're not going to really talk about this time. We're going to talk about media queries next time. Suffice it to say that something is going to probably be displayed differently on a mobile device and on a desktop, for example. So I have to have a way to handle that. Right, so let's select something out of this list, and it's actually going to be positioning. right? So there's a property, a CSS property, which is called position. Now, typically, if I don't say anything, the position is going to be what is called static. That's the default value, which means the browser is going to handle positioning. I'm not going to do anything about positioning. It's just the browser is going to decide. Now, if I change that value, something else is going to happen. So let's try to investigate this. So first we need a file, and I'm just going to copy paste it. It's not that complicated. It's a file which has a container and some parts. It's this one. Oh no, it's not this one. It's this one. Right, so it has a div which is called the container and a bunch of parts. Let's call it 16.css. Okay, let's make our 16.csx, and let's see. So first things first, let's call it some pseudo debug information. So what we might want to do is have a style which just shows the border of every component. So let's go here, and we're going to say this. So for all elements, this is the selector, the global selector, which has 0 specificity. They have a border, but it doesn't affect their size, right? They have box sizing, border box. Oh, we didn't test this out. It's if we set border box as box sizing, they fit. It's the dimension with the border. Right, so by default everything looks like this. Now the reason why it doesn't take up all space, I can see that the body element itself has a margin. I can take that out, but I don't really care. Right, so this is how my divs look like. So let's do something else. Let's add a couple of things. So let's say that our container is position relative. Now what does that mean? So it has a particular size. Now I can see that I'm positioning it with a property which is called left. Well, if I use this on something which is not positioned, so which doesn't have a different value from static in position, then left, right, top, bottom do nothing. They're going to be ignored. If something is positioned, right, so I am trying to affect its position, I have a bunch of values for the position property. And these represent positioning schemes, so to speak, so ways of positioning. So relative means that I let the browser calculate whatever the position of my element would be, and then from that position I take an offset, right? So from where it would have been drawn by default, I'm just going to reposition. So left is actually going to mean I'm going to go to the right. It's like applying a little push towards the left. So it's going to look like this. Now let's style the other thing. So part one, let's say, is also position relative. And now the question becomes, is this position relative to where it would have been to its parent or to the document, right? And it actually is to its parent. Now the reason for this is whenever I position something, this is called I'm taking it out of the drawing flow. So what I'm doing is I'm creating a new rendering tree. It's a new root for a new rendering tree, which is smaller, and I'm going to draw it separately, and then I'm going to give the main rendering process back just a pre-drawn little rectangle. Now let's also position the rest of them. So 2, we're going to move in its initial, so it's going to be right 100 px, and 3 and 4 we're just going to interchange. Right, so 3 is going to go downward, 4 is going to go upward. Right, so this is one positioning scheme. Right, that's 4 is going to go upward, 3 is going to go downward. This is one positioning scheme. Now, the second positioning scheme is something which is called position absolute, which is something which is a bit more intuitive in the sense that it works in a system of coordinates. But there's also, so it's not offsets, it's coordinates in left, right, top, bottom. But there's also something strange here. So when we talk about systems of coordinates, we generally think about an origin. And if the plane with the drawing over, right, the drawing surface would be infinite, that would make sense. But here, we're actually in a system of coordinates inside the rectangle, right? Because whatever I do, I'm going to be inside the rectangle. So what I can actually do is use coordinates starting from any corner, right? So I can do top left or bottom left, etc. Now let's see how this looks like. Having. Actually, the HTML is going to be the same thing it was before. And the CSS, well, it's not going to be the same thing. We're going to look at it shortly. And I'm just going to copy paste it and we're going to discuss it. Right, so again, I have my container, which is the same container in the same position. But this time my parts are position absolute. And this one is left top, so top left corner. This one is right top, so top right corner. And so forth. Right, so when I'm talking about coordinates inside the rectangle, which rectangle is it? Well, the answer is that position absolute is positioned in relation to the first ancestor, which is positioned. Now, again, to reiterate, we say something is positioned if they don't have the default value in the position property, which means part 1, part 2, etc. are going to be descendants of container. And if container is positioned, they're going to draw relative to it. Let's see this in action, right? So each one is in a corner. But what if container is not positioned, right? It doesn't have position relative. Then it's position static. Left has no significance whatsoever. And uh, whenever I try to draw these parts, I'm going to have to look further up. And up to where? Well, in my case, if there's nothing, no ancestor which is no parent or grandparent or whatever's which is positioned, I'm ultimately going to go to the document itself, which is always positioned, right? Right. So this is going to mean that I'm going to get this, right? Because I'm ignoring my parent, and I'm looking for something which is positioned. Now this actually doesn't quite show what's actually happening. So let's find a bunch of text. This was a bunch of text, so we can investigate this a bit further. Okay, so you can see that it's positioned to the original position of the rendered document, which means that they scroll with it. Now, the last positioning scheme, and again going to clone this, is something which is called position static, position fixed, sorry. And we can use this by just replacing fixed here in each of them. Now this time, whenever I do something which is position fixed, it's not in relation to the document, but rather 18. But rather in relation to the viewport, which means everything scrolls like this. So I can do a little overlay. I can do a menu which is always on screen, or one of those pop-ups which contains information, or an ad or whatnot. Right, so this is positioning. Now, there's also something else which is a bit stranger, which relates to a different property, although generally you could call it a positioning scheme. It's the idea of floats. So let's do 19.html. And again, we're going to have something with 4 parts. Only the parts are going to contain a bunch of text, so we just see them easy in an easy fashion. Right, so it's the same thing with the parts, only there's a bunch of text in them. And by default, obviously, they're going to just occupy the full length and so forth. Let me just create a 19.html.css. So let's investigate this. Okay, so by default, I'm going to get this button. Now let's assume that we give them a lower width. We're gonna say part 1 is width. Well, 50% is going to be 50% or whatever my parent made available to me. Let's say part 2 is with 30%, and let's say the other ones are 50%. Now, not much is going to change, however, because by default they're divs. They don't let anything sit next to them, right? So I'm just going to get this vertically. Now what I could do is mark one of them as being floating. Now if something is floating, it detaches from the document and it starts floating, as in the name, towards the direction I specified until it hits something, so to speak. Something stops it, which might be the border of the document, right? So it's either goes as much as the document allows it to go, or it might be something else which is floating. So let's make these floating one by one. Um, okay. So part 1, we're also going to color them so we can see what's sort of happening. Right, so this one is orange. It's floating. Um, However, nothing's next to it. Now let's make this one floating as well. Let me find the color. Right, so now it no longer insists on being, on being on its own separate line. It's floating. This one started, the orange one started floating, and what stopped it was the edge of the document. The blue one started floating, and what stopped it was the previous floating thing. Now let's see something really strange, which is what actually is floating. And you can see that this is something like many things in CSS, which is taken from typical, you know, book printing. And what's happening is that this one, the third, is actually behind them, and its content is flowing around them. So floats are a somewhat strange concept. Now let's see how we arrange this. So for part 3, we're going to do a couple of things. So first off, we're going to say clear left. Now what clear left is going to tell the browser is that part 3 isn't going to allow anything to its left. Right? It can't have something floating left. So if I reload this, I can see that, okay, so it can't have something to the left. So the first valid position is under these things, which are floating left, and itself is floating right. As for part 4, it has to be accommodating with everything. So it's just going to reflow its content underneath. And part 4, we're ultimately going to go and clear left and float right. I'm going to pause for a bit. Right, so it's we're recording again. Um, so like I said, floats are a bit strange. If you want, I can give you an article which is, call it funny, with somebody who wrote a browser engine. And it's when you get to edge cases, it's really hard to define what's going to happen. Now, generally, I'm not going to need floats anymore because I can use flex containers. But if I do, they're there. Now let's continue to a couple of other things which relate to how things are drawn. Now, something which we've not handled until now is what's going to happen if I have a parent and its child is larger than the parent, right? Because I can resize things. So what happens if I resize the child larger than the parent? So let's consider this, and let's just write the thing in this style here. So let's consider that outside is a 400 by 400 rectangle, square, sorry. Okay, that's fine. We can see it for now. Well, but let's consider that inside, for some reason, is something a bit larger. It's a 600 by 600 square. What's going to happen? Well, what's going to happen by default is uh, I'm going to overwrite outside. Uh, Even if only by the virtue of the thing I'm drawn later. We're going to see this. I've skipped over something and we're going to get back to that. Right, so what can I do in this situation? I can look at them, I can see that they're behind and so forth. So the structure is still correct. It's just, right, this is inside, outside. Right, so I might decide on one of two things. Now we're going to do this in the both on the x and y axis, but it can be done it can be done just on the x or the y axis, so to speak. So it's overflow. We can do overflow hidden, and I can do only overflow x or only overflow y. And this is just going to crop the child so it's not visible anymore. Or I can do overflow scroll, and this is going to allow me to scroll through the content. Now, before I forget, let's do something else, which is, so we have two dimensions from what it seems, right? Because you have an x and a y, which can be manipulated in various ways, uh, depending on the positioning scheme and so forth. But actually, we have three axes. It's just that the third axis is just an ordinal axis, right? So if I look at, if I have two squares drawn on the page, I can actually see what the distance between them is. Now, an ordinal axis doesn't allow me to do that. What I can say on an ordinal axis is which is larger than which is the order, right? So let's consider the following example. Let's have the 21 HTML. And this is actually going to look like one of those parts files. This one. Right, and let me just find the CSS because it's going to be right. This is the thing. Okay, so oh, 21.css. Right, so what I have here, we're just going to comment it for now. Comment everything. So what I have here is the structure I had earlier, right? So it's 21.html. It's this thing. Now let's consider that we add a bunch of parts, and first these parts are going to be larger and larger, right? So the first one is 100 by 100, the second one is 200 by 200, and so forth. They have different colors. And the last one, which is notable, is going to be red. Now I notice there's no parts. That's because everything is behind. They've been drawn in order, and the the later a part comes, the more it's going to override. Now, what if I want to change this? Well, I can use this z axis and say z index as 1 or 2, -1, -2, etc. So something which has a larger z index is going to be in front of something which has a smaller z index. So this is my third axis. So this is going to give me this. Okay, something else. we have a couple more things to talk about. And for this, we're going to need another little file, which is going to by now look familiar. Right, so I have this 22.css. Let me just create it. So if we look at our initial state, we should recognize the state is the default state. Now let's consider that we want to do a couple of things. So first, let's call it debug style. Okay, so it's in 22.css, so we can just better see what we're dealing with. Now let's resize these, right? So we're going to resize them so they're little boxes of 100 by 100 pixels. Okay, so I'm gonna say container dev. One sec. So we're gonna say container dev is 100 by 100. So all divs within this container. Right, so this looks like this. Now the divs in their display block, so they don't get anything next to them. We could make them floating, or maybe we could do something else. Now this example is interesting for various reasons, but one of them is that the way we think in this example is the way that flexboxes are going to run. So what I might do is I might figure out that if I want something to fit neatly on a line, I might want to treat them as characters, right? And we've already discussed something about display block and display inline. So let's just try to make them display inline. Whoops, not quite what I expected. So there's a couple of problems here. So the first problem is that I see they're really small. Well, they're really small because something which is inline isn't actually dimensionable. So I can't, if I use height and width, they don't do anything. Right, so let's try something else. There's an inline block, which is something which is inline but is dimensional. Now the second thing I might notice is that they have a space between them. Now what is that space? It's character spacing. Right, so we might want to, which is called letter spacing. We might want to do something else, which is we want to do container letter spacing, and we're gonna say minus 5 pixels. Okay, so now they look pretty cool. Now let's try to style each and one of them, each and every one of them, and see what we can do with that. But before that, we might want to center the text. Now, how would we do that? Well, for horizontal, it's going to be really simple. But for vertical, at least in traditional CSS, it's going to be really complicated. In the sense that CSS initially came with the mentality of having a drawing surface which is known, which has a known width, it has a finite width, and an infinite height, which means it's really hard to center things vertically. Now, a workaround, which is traditional, is that I might think about what I can center vertically. What does the browser know how to center vertically? Well, if I look at lines of text wherever they appear, I see that they're not quite, the text doesn't join the text, above it or below it. There's a little space between the text on one line and the text on the line above it, for example. So the space that's available to a line is a bit larger than just the text. And the text within the line is centered vertically on that space. So what I might do to get vertical centering is I might consider that the inside the content of one of these little boxes is actually a line of text, right? So the box is a line of text, which has the line of text is as high as the container itself, as the box itself. And this is going to allow me to center its content. I know it's a strange way of thinking. So line height 100 pixels, but it works. Now let's style each and every one of them. So first things first, let's say part 1 has a couple of margins. We want to investigate this margin business. So there's a margin which is top and a margin which is right. And the behavior of horizontal margins is different from vertical margins. So vertically, what's happened is that one not only pushed itself from the top, but also the whole row of things, because this actually works like a row of text. Incidentally, it also works as a reflowable interface, but it's a row of text. Horizontally, it pushed its neighbor so that the margin was respected. Now let's try the neighbor. Well, the neighbor is going to have some margins itself. So it's going to do bottom, top, and left. Now bottom, there's no other margin bottom, which means it's actually going to push the space they need in the document. If we save it. Right, so I have the space now. Now vertically, 1 had a 100 pixel margin and 2 had a 200 pixel margin. And the way that vertical margins compose is that I take the larger one. Right, so it's 200 pixels. It's two little squares that might be visible. Horizontally, however, margins are composed by addition. Right, so I add the margin of 1 with the margin of 2. So the right margin of 1 with the left margin of 2. Margins can also have negative values. So if I do this, they're actually going to join again. But I don't want that. Right. Now we've seen display inline, we've seen display block. There's something else, and in order to investigate this something else, let's make a little detour. There's a property called visibility. Let's say part 3 has visibility hidden. Let's see what happens. Well, it disappeared, but it still takes place. It still takes some space, see? So although it's not shown, its renderable box exists and keeps everything else from taking its space. Now, what about if we make part 4 something else? And that is display none. First of all, we have a problem, which is display none here comes into conflict with this one, display inline block. And this rule is more specific. So this means that nothing's going to happen. However, we might make this last rule more specific than the first one. And now something strange has happened, which is, of course, part 4 is not shown. But more importantly, it doesn't take up any space. It just doesn't exist. Okay? It's not part of the rendering tree. And that's what display none does. Now we're going to stop here. I'm going to stop the recording and then answer any additional questions you might have.